Thanks everybody for coming tonight. Let's see, great speakers coming up. So let me just tell you, the artist in residence talks are a little bit erratic. This is our third one. In every case, they've been world-class speakers, and tonight's no exception. Of course, the SETI Institute has a weekly colloquia on Tuesday. Many of you know that. So tonight, on Earth Day, we have two really special speakers and people that I both met in the last couple months. So we have Marc Weidenbaum, who is a sound explorer, I think is one of the things we said. He's an educator and a writer and a really interesting guy. And this book just came out, Selected Ambient Works, Volume 2, about Aphex Twin. And it's really exceptional. Marc's a very interesting man. So he's going to speak. And then we have Ed Frenkel, and his book is here. And unlike some of the stars of our late night shows, I've actually read the books both, and they're really good. Love and Math came out a few months ago, and Ed was at PS1, which is the Contemporary Art Museum, one of the great ones in New York, and I thought that was very interesting, a mathematician speaking in the context of contemporary art. And so, as might happen in New York, we met at a cocktail party and started speaking, and I asked him to be here. He's based in Berkeley, and that worked out. But beyond that, what I thought would be very interesting is if we would have these two very different individuals in conversation. I thought that would be very unusual, and they both responded to that because they both said they hadn't had that type of conversation. We did a little bit of a warm-up last week where we met for dinner and started to talk it out a bit, get a little bit of a framework. So it's really a treat, and it's it's an intimate setting, and I think very fortunate for all of you that you get to be here. Listen to these two quite extraordinary and singular individuals, and then ask them questions. So I'll bring them up in a second. Let's see, a couple things I wanted to say is a little bit of shameless self-promotion for the Artist in Residence program. I'm speaking at Moogfest next Saturday in Asheville. So is Doug Vakosh on separate panels, which is going to be an incredible event of music and futurists and speakers. And then the show Adrian was talking about is an installation I'm doing at the Bolinas Museum in Marin County, opens June 7th. We're speaking June 14th at the Community Center, so that's over the Golden Gate Bridge and an hour north of San Francisco. And in some ways that's the first, the program's about 3 years old right now, the Artist in Residence program. And a lot of things have happened through it, talks and being in contact with artists, both myself and the Institute and so on. But this installation is really bringing together a work that I did in collaboration with Lawrence Doyle, who wrote algorithms and had the idea of looking into the research to see what Lawrence determined is that humpback whale communications have syntax. And I thought that that was just a fabulous idea. I mean, it's a language we don't know. I got asked to do a sound installation at the last operational Morse code transmitting and receiving facility in the US, which is also in Bolinas and Point Reyes National Seashore. And so I've merged the ideas of Morse code, not only because it's a dying language, but because of its coded nature, with the idea of the whale communications, which is, of course, a language that we don't yet speak. So, moving right along, I believe Marc's going to start, and so he'll speak, then Ed will come up, then we'll have a quick break for beer, wine, water, and so on, a very quick one, and then we'll just have the two of them speaking to each other, and we'll see how that goes, and then we'll bring in a couple questions from the audience and let that transpire as it does. But thanks everybody for being here.
I'm just going to.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone. That's the video. The audio is on my iPod Touch, so just give me one moment. Thank you. So I just want to say thanks first to SETI for inviting me. I really appreciate it. To Ed for sharing the stage with me, and to Charles for setting the whole thing up. It's very much appreciated. I recently had a book published, as Charles mentioned, and so my publisher would like to thank you as well.
Copies here.
Just this one that Charles brought, because he's much smarter about these things than I am. I learn a step at a time. So when Charles asked me to speak at SETI, he asked what I wanted to talk about. And I do a lot of different things, all circulating around the intersection of sound and art and technology. And I'd recently published this book, as Ed mentioned. I write for places like Nature. I have my own website, disquiet.com, since 1996. I teach a course about the role of sound in the media landscape. And I gave a lot of thought to SETI and to what would be appropriate. I thought about the central focus of communication to what you do here. I thought about the ideas of indirect and chance communication, and especially communication that isn't inherently verbal. I thought about the interconnected arrays of radio telescopes and about the network effect of SETI at home, that pioneering achievement. So in turn, I welcome this ultimately as an opportunity to share my experience with a specific thing that I've been doing for a while now, an ongoing and expansive network community of hundreds of musicians around the world and sound artists that I initiated at the start of 2012. I should say that the project's now a little over 2 years old, but I'm still learning to speak about it because of all the investigations that I'm engaged in. This is the one that I probe the least in terms of trying to figure out how it works. So this talk is me walking around trying to figure it out because I don't totally want to demystify it, but I do want to share what I've learned in the past 2 years about working with hundreds of musicians, upwards of 450 at this point, around the world each week. So what I'm going to talk about is network creativity, the idea of creativity on a network, and specifically in the context of the Disquiet Junto, which is the name of this group that I mentioned. So in 2 nights, I'm going to ask hundreds of musicians one single question. And I do this every Thursday night. Every Thursday evening, I log on to soundcloud.com, which is a very popular place on the web to share audio. And I upload an idea, a prompt. And every Thursday since January 5th, 2012, I've done this. And I've posted a compositional idea, a compositional prompt. Anyone can join in as long as you play with music and sound. And this Thursday's will be the 121st such weekly project. We've uploaded at this point some 3,200 tracks, and there have been many more that have slowly faded as counts have come and gone. So what I want to do first is just share with you some of the questions I've asked in the past and some of the remarkable music and the collaborations that have come out of it. So one such example is this. The question I found myself asking was, how can it be that classical music inspired abstract expressionism? I was at the Clifford Still Museum in Denver, if you've ever had the chance to visit there. It's a lovely place, a huge building made of concrete dedicated to just one contemporary American artist. And not only because it's dedicated to him, you get a chance to walk around and see not just his art, but parts of his life. They have his smock, they have his paint cans, they have his library, and they have his record collection. You can see the music that he was listening to as he painted. And while he was making images that look like the one reproduced in this little SoundCloud file, what he was listening to was Bach and Beethoven and Mozart. This is a bit of the Brandenburg Concerto here, which I sent out to the SoundCloud group on the 36th week of its existence. And about 40 musicians from around the world collectively took this track and turned it into what became something abstract expressionist. And the way we did this was the following. I simply shared with them how the Clifford Still Museum itself defined abstract expressionism, which is marked by abstract forms, expressive brushwork, and monumental scale. And I said somehow inside his head, Clifford Still's head, this music inspired this visual art. So what if we had this music inspire sonic art? And this is one example of it. This is by Gregor Bujanek from Poland. Here's another example of a project. That's how one art form inspires another art form. But stepping back, I'm intrigued by how art is informed by how we experience nature and the world around us, how everyday sounds inspire us. There's a musical quality to the San Francisco Bay. It's hard not to stand near the bay and to not take in all the sounds around you, the birdsong and the foghorns and so forth, and not in your head transform them into music in some way and say, oh, how musical. But what if we do that literally? And so I sent out the sound of a foghorn and a train whistle to the community. And I said, let's take this literally. Let's take the music that's inside our head that we hear in the natural environment, and let's, wrong track. Here we go. And let's listen to it as if it were music. So this is by Jay Butler, who's from Pittsburgh. They start off quiet. Perhaps a bit closer to home, so to speak. When Voyager left the solar system, NASA uploaded to the web 2 bursts of sounds that it caught. And this idea of Voyager going away was something that had a kind of sadness to it, and also a sense of excitement. So I sent these sounds out to the collective group and said to them, let's make a little goodbye song for Voyager out of this. Let's say goodbye in form of sound. And this is what Mark Ward made of that, who's from Sheffield. And for each of these examples that I'm playing, this one's a little subtler, there are between 7 or 8 and 70 different tracks. I think the most we had one week was 71 tracks for a prompt. This week I think we had about 45. So those are just 3 projects among many. And this coming week is going to be the 121st, which I'll talk about at the very end of the presentation. So how this all originated, how this idea of me working with musicians directly came out of my experience as a music journalist. I've written about music and sound professionally for about a quarter century, and my favorite thing to do is to interview musicians. I like nothing so much as calling up a musician or meeting them in person, and artists as well, and asking about what they do. And what that means is I sit in front of a musician, I ask them about 50 questions. Numerous topics are explored to get a sense of who this individual is. And what the Junto is, it flips that, and what I'm really doing is sending one question out to 50 people, or ultimately about 50 will respond. I'm actually sending out to about 750. And we all collectively hone in on a particular response. How this originated was that having written about music since 1988, 1989 professionally, in 2006, Brian Eno and David Byrne uploaded to the web for free stems, individual portions of one of their best records, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, if you're familiar with it. And they allowed anyone who wanted to remix it for free. And it was an exciting project, but I wasn't really enjoying what I heard. And my immediate response was, I wish the people I knew, I wish musicians I admired would work on this project. So I just, without really thinking about it too much, I just sent the music files out to people whose work I admired and said, would you mind participating in this? And that led to the first collaboration project I did back in 2006. And in subsequent years, I did more and more of these projects where I sent out these prompts to musicians and again began to ask a dozen musicians or 24 musicians a question in sound, and they responded in sound. 2011, I did the biggest, most successful of these I did, where I sent out images from Instagram, if you're familiar with it. I sent out 25 musicians' Instagram photos to each other. I mixed them up and said, here, this image is the cover of your next single. Go ahead and record what that single sounds like. And that became incredibly popular. That has, at this point, had 120,000 streams of this fairly abstract electronic music. And I'll talk about the genre as this proceeds. So these projects fall into various categories, and key among them are forging partnerships, which is part of the reason I'm so excited to be here today. We've done a lot of partnerships with interesting individuals and organizations. We did a Shostakovich remix with an ensemble called Wild Up from Los Angeles, where they gave us a live recording they'd done of Shostakovich concerto, and we reworked it, but with a particular aesthetic goal in mind, which was their own. There's a director named Christine Knowlton who's directing a film about, I kid you not, blind competitive sailing. And she gave us the trailer to her film, to her documentary, and we, in return, gave her about 30 different potential scores for the trailer, and then she employed one of those professionally. And then there's a Creative Commons open source programmer named Basil Katarbel, who is in prison in Syria right now. In fact, just last month marked the 2-year anniversary of his imprisonment in Syria. And we took a work of art that he was engaged with until his imprisonment, and we created sound to accompany it as a way to keep the project alive in his absence. These are examples of the sort of partnerships we've forged for weekly projects. But at its heart, even those projects themselves are probing ideas. And so the sort of ideas that we probe are a sonic palindrome. We're familiar with a palindrome, so the question then is, what if we composed music that was intended to be heard both forward and backwards? Toward the end of the last presidential election, we took the almost horizontal, almost parallel lines of Romney and Obama of their polling data, and we read them as melodies. And we read the broader source that was collated to collect those those 2 lines, and we treated those as chords. And we had this idea of a doorbell suite. You know, if you're sitting at home and the doorbell rings, you don't know who it is. But what if you had the ability to have a quiet doorbell you could click on if your child's sleeping, or a specific one that only your friends knew the code for? And so we made sort of music for functional purpose. What if there was a handful of sounds that you could elect to have for your doorbell instead of just one? These are just the sort of range of projects that we've had. And I don't make music myself, not directly at least, though apparently I'm responsible for about 3,000 tracks, at least indirectly. But I do engage with sound a lot through my work, and this project is just one example. And so in the research for my book, on occasion, when I was exploring an idea in the music of this ambient musician, Aphex Twin, 20 years ago he released this record last month. And my book was released to mark the 20th anniversary, and it's a book-length exploration of the music on the record. And it's ambient music, it's very quiet. It has a rhythmic curiosity to it, but it's also made quite sedate. And I would explore ideas in the album, then I'd send those ideas out to the Junto, the Disquiet Junto, my music group. And I wouldn't necessarily say this is inspired by this, because sometimes they were tangential, but as a test, as an experiment, I would send the idea out there and get some music back. And so one of those ideas is, does a wind chime have a beat? A wind chime is a very interesting object from history. And it is, in many ways, the original. In many ways, it's the original generative instrument. If you're familiar with the idea of a generative instrument, it's something that is a composition in physical form, or it's composition in system form. A certain person who makes a wind chime is selecting notes and relative pitch and distance from each other and even frequency. But ultimately, they're not in full control of the sequence in which they go. But if you listen to this, this is by Naoki Sasanami, who's a great musician from Tokyo, very frequent participant, very active participant in the junto. As you listen to it, there's a metric temperament to it. It doesn't have a meter per se, which is how we think about beat in rhythm, but it has a metric temperament, a kind of, over time, the change has the semblance of a rhythm, and we explored that. So this is an example where I myself, in my research, benefited from the collective thinking. So I mentioned this idea of experimental music, and that is broadly speaking what this is referred to. And as Brian Eno has said, it's called experimental music for a reason, and that's because sometimes experiments fail. But they fail on purpose, and they fail because someone's trying something out. And so one of the long-standing jokes about experimental music is that if you go to a concert of experimental music and you ask everyone in the audience, which is to say all 5 of them, what it is that what they do, they'll probably all tell you that they are themselves also musicians, or there's one critic out there as well. And that's a joke, and it's a joke that sort of ribs the seriousness of the endeavor, but I started to look at that joke and wonder, well, what if it's not a joke at all? What if there's something positive about that? What if the idea of music created by people for each other in this communal way, what's the positive aspect of that? I'm not going to say that it's not unfortunate there are not more people in the audience or that it doesn't have broader reach, but let's put all those populist concerns aside and just say, what are the benefits of this sense of music community? And that's what really drove me. And one thing I've really been exploring is this idea of experimental music and what the term means. And I found that the term experimental music is not necessarily entirely beneficial, and I've been slowly exploring this alternate idea of interrogative music. Because the experiment is the activity. The experiment is what you do. But the idea behind it is what's really important. The idea that you're pursuing, the technique that you're testing, that's the purpose of it. So reframing it as interrogative music has been beneficial for me to talk about it and to explore it as a more social endeavor. One thing I want to be clear whenever I talk about the Disquiet Junto is that this idea did not originate with me by any means. I started this specific project January 5th, 2012. I sent a note out to the internet in various forms and I said, please record the sound of ice in a glass and make something of it. That was the very first Disquiet Junto project. But long before I did it, there was the Iron Chef of Music projects, and after that there were the Beat Battles, sponsored by Stone's Throw Records. And since the launch of Disquiet Junto, there have been other groups such as Extrospection and Naviar Haiku that do similar sort of communal music projects. The haiku one's really quite lovely. They simply post a different haiku every week and say, record something inspired by this. It's quite lovely. So what all these groups have in common is people collaborating asynchronously, but not toward a single goal of creating a track together, but toward a collective goal, a communal goal. It's not uncommon to say that musicians, among other artists, are in touch with their inner child. That's a kind of common phrase, but the thing that really intrigues me about that childlike nature of creativity isn't just the nature of play, but a specific type of play, which in childhood development is referred to as parallel play. If you're familiar with the idea, parallel play is the stage at which children are playing side by side, but are not actually interacting. It's between when mobility kicks in, but before they start throwing a ball back and forth. That period is a really fascinating one, and I'm really interested in how it plays out in adults as well. When you work in a library, you feel much more comfortable working in a cafe than at home. When you feel the idea in the Disquiet Junto that when you're doing this music project around the world, there's some 100 musicians also exploring the same idea. What is the benefit of that? What, as human beings, do we experience when we know someone else is trying the same thing? It gets to this idea of the experiment. It gets the idea of having a place where you're comfortable failing. Early on in the existence of the junto, I mentioned online that I felt that I'd created a place where people felt it was safe enough that they could fail publicly. And I got such a positive response from the participants about that. The idea that they knew that they could fail, but other people were failing alongside them, gave them the comfort to actually be more creative and more prolific. So if there's one slightly larger than average word that I wanted to just toss out there during this talk, it's one that's been really helpful for me, this idea of acoustomology. It's not as familiar as the term it's derived from, which is the idea of a soundscape. The soundscape was introduced by R. Murray Schafer, a composer and environmentalist from Canada. And it's a very influential term about the idea of the sounds that surround us. But if the soundscape is the collective sounds that exist in a place, acoustomology, which is credited to Stephen Feld, a very talented academic, acoustomology is the sound inherent potentially in a place. It's the potential energy, the potential sound of an individual place. And one of the things that I'm intrigued by is, so for example, a jazz band from Denver, a jazz band from Detroit, a jazz band from Miami, they might all sound similar, but the potential for particular types of music to originate in different individual locations are fed by history and culture and technology and by the environment and by the economy. And so similarly, what is the acoustomology of the internet? What sounds are inherent in the internet? And the Disquiet Junto is an attempt to figure out what a community on the internet can achieve. And to do that, you had to sort of reverse engineer it and feel about what is implicit in the way that the internet functions. Well, clearly we figured some things out, but even when you grasp the potential of the internet, you can still, fortunately, be quite surprised. 1 year ago this month, I'm going to pull up another track. I'm not checking my email. 1 year ago this month, on April 4th, 2012, I was working in a cafe, finishing up an important section of my book. And word got out that a musician who went by the name of No-Fi, Jeffrey Melton, had passed away. He had a young child. He was quite young himself, but he was no longer with us. And it hit me so hard, this person I'd never met. I walked straight home. I told my wife what had happened. I collapsed on the bed. And that very next week, we did a project where we tried to pay tribute to him. And I thought about the way to do it. And what we did was, and I'll play this first and then explain to you what you're listening to. Jess Lamont from a very talented woman in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This is Project 66. What we did was I sent one individual track that No-Fi himself, Jeffrey Melton himself, recorded and performed live, solo, posted to the web and said, anyone who wants to, here's the instruction for this week's project. Go in a room alone, press play, and record yourself playing along with us. So we had about 40 or 50 tracks of people playing along with music by a dead person. It was an incredibly touching project, and really the outpouring of emotion and productivity and concern, it astounded me. I knew at that point, by middle of last year or early part of last year, we had a community going, but the first death really doesn't test a community, it really gives you, it gives you a sense of the emotional room tone of that community. So the most frequent question I get about the Junto is, where do all these ideas come from? You're coming up on week 121. Where do these ideas originate? And the thing is that I don't think about them in terms of questions or ideas. The way they originate is I have thoughts and curiosity. The way that each project comes up each week is that I try to reframe it as a question. I don't set out to come up with questions. I just think, well, what intrigues me right now? What did I see on television? What news report? The Voyager just left the solar system. Then I just simply try to reframe it as a question, and that's the intriguing thing for me. It's a bit of a cliche, unfortunately, this quote from Ezra Pound, but I hope it has not diminished its importance. His idea that the artists are the antennae of a race. I know the word antennae is a loaded one in this room, but the idea of the artists of the antennae of a race is simply saying that alongside scientific endeavors, alongside academic endeavors, alongside many other endeavors, is the idea of the artist probing similar questions. Maybe not the exact same questions, but framing the idea in a way that they themselves can approach similar explorations. And so to be clear, this exploration isn't about something unique to online creativity. This is about exploring creativity in general, in particular the networkness of creativity. Like when I talked about parallel productivity and the idea of people in a similar place understanding collectively that they're pursuing something together. This is what I learn each week when I fail or succeed in putting prompts out there that people respond to. What's the right communal sensibility and how can we learn from that? There's a frequent understanding when you see historical photos of famous artists, famous musicians, famous scientists. What an incredible coincidence they were all in the same place at the same time. How remarkable that Picasso and all these other artists were in the same place. How amazing these scientists that same year were at the same school. And the thing that I've come to understand is that it's not a coincidence that they were in the same place. It's not coincidence that these remarkable places were in the same, people in the same place. It's the fact that they were in the same place that helped them become remarkable. This coming Thursday in 2 days, when I ask a question, when I pose a compositional prompt, it's going to arise out of this discussion. It's going to come largely out of Ed Frenkel's book. So I ask that if you make music, if you make sound, if you like to play with sound, please log on Thursday, take a look at the question, and maybe join in the collaboration. That's the Disquiet Junto. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. Well, that was great. Okay, so that was fantastic. Thank you. So I'll introduce Ed Frenkel now. And Ed is, I think if you're allowed to say that, grew up as a prodigy mathematician. He's a great mathematician in the truest sense, but he's also a lot more than that. Very curious person. And I think besides big intelligence, there's this incredible curiosity. I'm not sure if those two always go hand in hand or not. But that's part of why these two gentlemen are here tonight. So without saying too much more, I think most of you that are here and most that are going to watch this somewhere tomorrow and onward in the future will know who Ed is. So I'm going to let him come up and say whatever he's about to say. And we'll go from there. Thanks very much for being here.
You know, so you can tell, right? So let's see if this works. It does. Well, it's great to be here at SETI. That's the first time I'm here, and I want to thank Charles, first of all, for giving me this opportunity to speak here. Which, by the way, you guys don't know, but today is Charles' birthday. Happy birthday! And of course, today is also Earth Day. So it's such a great pleasure. Thank you. And also, Mark, it's such a great pleasure to share a stage with you. You know, I recently met Mark through Charles, and I discovered his book, which was already mentioned earlier. And I was reading it in the last few weeks, and it really opened a new world for me. So thank you for that. And thanks again, Charles, for introducing me to such a wonderful person and in a totally different area. My sister is a musician, actually, and so in my family, the running joke in my family is that I took all her mathematical abilities, and she took away all my music abilities. But this is such a great opportunity to somehow to enter this world of music, so I want to talk a little bit about that. But first, of course, I want to acknowledge this wonderful place, SETI, and what a great pleasure to be here today. Less than a week after this wonderful announcement about the planet, Kepler 186f, to which this institute has contributed. And who knows, maybe 500 years from today, these wonderful creatures will be watching this event. And so I'm a mathematician, so I want to start by talking a little bit about mathematics. And there is this beautiful quote from Galileo. Galileo said that the laws of nature are written in the language of mathematics. And so the question then is mathematics really a universal language? Is there only one and only mathematics? There's one and only mathematics, or are there different kinds of mathematics? Do we invent and create mathematics, or do we discover it? Or put it differently, would aliens, if we meet the aliens, would they have the same math? And I'm actually asked very often this question. You'll be surprised how often. I'm wondering if some of those people who ask me actually secretly are aliens. But, and actually there are different schools of thought on that. Some people think we'll have the same math. I actually happen to think we'll share the same math. But some people think that may not be the case. Well, I usually think of aliens as some creatures like that. And so you see 1, 2, 3. So kind of like we also have people here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So then it's natural to assume that we would all have to count, and so we will all arrive at natural numbers, and then fractions, and then algebraic numbers, etc., etc. But one typical argument that I want to address that is made is, what if it's a kind of a Solaris-like intelligence? I don't know if you saw the movie Solaris, the original by Tarkovsky, or a more recent version with George Clooney and David Duchovny's wife from Californication. No, not many fans of Californication. It's okay. So a Solaris-like intelligence would be just this one creature, one intelligent creature. So there would be no reason for it to count because it wouldn't have anyone next to it of the same kind. So then the argument goes, well, such a creature would then not discover numbers the way we do, because we have, many of us, but maybe would discover something else, something that has to do with continuity, and functions, etc. But actually, there is an interesting point here that I think is very important, which underscores the fact that the same concept in mathematics doesn't have to come from the same place. I would argue that a Solaris-like intelligence would discover natural numbers, just like we discover natural numbers. And the reason is that numbers actually kind of grow from different areas of mathematics. And counting is really not the only way in which we can discover numbers. For example, we can discover numbers through winding. So imagine that you have a pole and you have a thread, and you can then weave this thread around this pole. And you can thread it, you can weave it several times. And depending on which direction, you can say it's a positive number or negative number. So let's say if you go clockwise, it will be a negative number. If your thread misses the pole, then there is no winding, so it's number 0. If you go clockwise, it will be -1. If you go once, -1. Go twice, -2. And if you go counterclockwise, you'll get 1, 2, 3, right? And so likewise, a spherical creature would discover winding, because you can also map a sphere onto a sphere in many different ways. It will kind of wrap onto itself. And so this, I think, is a good illustration. This is what mathematicians, by the way, call homotopy groups. So I think it's a good illustration that of sort of this unity of mathematics, that the same powerful idea, like idea of numbers, could actually come from different directions. And so what I like to think of mathematics is a kind of this giant jigsaw puzzle. Yes, it is possible that an alien civilization would sort of work in a different part of the puzzle, right? So it's the same image, but we are trying to solve this giant jigsaw puzzle. We don't know what the final image is going to look like. And we humans, we work on this one part of the puzzle, and we are kind of making it bigger and bigger. And then other maybe civilization, they would work in a different part of the puzzle. But eventually we will converge. Eventually we will be building the same. We will be building the same one. And so it's kind of like, well, on Earth Day, a jigsaw puzzle of the surface of the Earth. You can think of mathematics also, it consists of different continents. And maybe we're building some of them, but we don't know others. But this also brings into focus the question of unity, the question of connecting different disciplines, different parts of mathematics. And to give you just one example of this different continents of math, number theory is one. And number theory, of course, we just talked about numbers and whole numbers, but then you got fractions, you got square root of 2, you got pi, you got real numbers, complex numbers, etc., etc. So that's one area of mathematics, a giant, vast area of mathematics. Then you have another one, harmonic analysis, which brings it home to closer to Marc's talk about music and about harmony and sound and frequency. So that's something that we appreciate, the fact that the sound of a symphony is composed of the notes of different instruments. And each of them is a basic wave. So we can decompose a general signal as a superposition of different waves, right? Of different harmonics. That's the idea of harmonic analysis. And it turns out to be very useful in mathematics in a much more general context where much more general functions or signals can be decomposed in terms of this basic harmonics. And so at the outset, these two continents of mathematics, these two fields don't have anything to do with each other. But actually, it turns out that they are closely connected. These two continents are connected to each other. And this became, there were some intimations, there were some inklings of connections that were known before. But this really happened, these connections were really firmly established recently, relatively recently, less than 50 years ago, in the late 1960s. And this was all started by mathematician Robert Langlands, who actually is a picture of him at his office at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, which actually was formerly occupied by Albert Einstein. So Langlands launched what became known as this Langlands program, which I like to think of as kind of a bridge between number theory and harmonic analysis. And likewise, I think it could be that there could be some unknown areas of mathematics which we humans don't know yet. But if we meet real intelligence, or artificial intelligence for that matter, if we meet somebody from Kepler 186F, they may be aware of this other continent and they will tell us all about it, and we'll tell them all about the math we know. And that would be such a wonderful way to learn from each other. Or you can also learn some stuff from my book, Love and Math, which was mentioned earlier. I talk a lot about this Langlands program and things like that. The point I make in my book is that, unfortunately, we are deprived, most of us, of the real beauty of mathematics. And the usual analogy I make is between painting a fence and paintings of the great masters. In both cases, paint is involved, but of course, to totally different ends. But I guess in this, on this occasion, it would probably be better to make an analogy with music and kind of say the true beauty of mathematics can be, it's like experiencing the beauty of a great concerto of Mozart, as opposed to just trying to read music sheets and kind of just looking at the notation and kind of seeing the trees but not seeing the forest. So that's unfortunately the way mathematics is presented in our society. But actually, there's so much more to it. And a great Charles Darwin put it very eloquently. He said, you know, mathematics really represents an extra sense. So here we talk about music. So we talk about a particular range of frequencies, which, you know, even you'd think it's a very small, very narrow range of frequencies, but so much beauty can be created within that range. Something like from I read somewhere from 17 hertz to 17,000 hertz for most people. Then, of course, we also have art that we can appreciate as well. We use another sense for that. But one could argue that mathematics also represents a kind of a sense, an extra sense, and maybe it's possible. Is it possible that we actually connect to mathematical ideas through that sense? That mathematical concepts and ideas are not actually invented by us, but maybe we kind of connect to them and we perceive them in a different world, as if they come from a different world. And that brings me to this interesting question about the sort of Platonic world of ideas, of mathematical ideas. Think about it this way. If Mozart, I mentioned Mozart concertos, what if we lost one of them? What if the house was burnt and all the scores were burnt with it? And there's no reason to believe that someone else would have written exactly the same piece of music, right? But Pythagoras, if Pythagoras had not lived, or if his work had been destroyed, we would still have the Pythagoras theorem. No matter what new advances in technology occur or whatever new evidence emerges, mathematical truths remain. They are timeless, persistent, and necessary truths. And there's something very special about mathematics, that this consistency and this inevitability of it, that makes one wonder as to where these ideas come from. And so some mathematicians argue that actually mathematics exists outside of human mind, and we're not creating mathematics, but we're discovering it. And a great logician called Gödel was a proponent of that view, and he said beautifully, mathematical concepts form an objective reality of their own, which we cannot create or change, but only perceive and describe. The jury's still out on that, but it's a very interesting possibility, I think, that it's kind of interesting because what it means is that all of us, humans, have something in common. You meet someone, you don't know who they are, where they come from, what their cultural background. They may not even speak the same language, but you know right away that Pythagoras theorem means the same thing to them as it means to you. Even if they don't know what Pythagoras theorem is, it still belongs to them. There is nothing to stop them from discovering Pythagoras theorem or any other idea or theorem in mathematics. Once they are discovered, they are there for us to share. They belong to all of us, and no one can take them away from us. In a way, it is similar with music, but music is more subjective. Our perception of music is more subjective. Someone might like this piece of music, someone might not like this other piece of music. We interpret them differently. But mathematics has this constancy, objectivity, and independence of the observation, of perception. And that's something I think that's very important. And that's where I think, and that's the reason why it is very interesting to find this area of interface between the two subjects. The two subjects seem to be so different, and yet there are so many similarities. So just to sort of finish the talk, I wanted to throw this one idea where you probably already know about this, where mathematics immediately enters music when you talk about the scales and the tones and the pitches. It turns out it's very mathematical. So let's talk a little about the sound of music. So Western music is based on this, what you call chromatic scale. So you got this 12 pitch classes, and usually you can call A, B, C, D, E, F, G in English, or the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and then you have this extra 5, so 7 basic ones and the extra 5s between them. So if you look at the piano, you got white keys and black keys. That's what they are. And the important thing is that you got this octave, and when you make full circle, you go higher and higher and higher in pitch, you come back, and the frequency of the sound, which will be sort of on top of this one, will be double the frequency of A, and likewise for the others, right? So the frequency gets doubled. But then what are the frequencies of the notes in the middle, in the intermediate notes? What are the frequencies of the intermediate notes? Well, it turns out that actually, for only recently, the musicians have sort of have found common ground. And even now, there are many different ways of doing this. So I was shocked when I first found out about this. I was shocked. I thought, well, at the very least, the musicians must agree as to what each sound, each note means. That's not the case. And for centuries, in fact, there was a tremendous battle going on. I mentioned Galileo, but actually his father, I found out, Vincenzo Galileo, was actually one of the proponents of the so-called equal temperament at the end of the 17th century, equal temperament, as opposed to the just temperament, which goes back to Pythagoras and which had been used for centuries. And only recently there's been the switch to the equal temperament, and then of course you also got Bach and his well-tempered clavier, which is kind of in the middle, in between the two. So I think it's absolutely fascinating that such a simple mathematical problem, well, to a mathematician this appears as a very simple mathematical problem, has actually been up for this debate. And there's something very interesting about kind of use and misuse of mathematics in the real world. So what do I mean by mathematics? Well, if you ask a mathematician, anyone will tell you a solution to the problem because, okay, so the most natural thing would be to keep the ratio between the frequencies of the nearby sounds the same. So that means, so let's say F0 was one of the notes, and F1 will be some A times that, F2 will be the same A times F1, and so on and so forth, right? But then when you make full circle, you got the 12th one, you multiply by A 12 times. So you get the 12th power of that number. But also you know that when you make full circle, it has to double. Everybody agrees it has to double. But if it's double, that means that that number, A, is the 12th root of 2. 2 to the power 1 over 12. So I'm assuming some basic algebra here, I guess. That the possibility of raising numbers to non-whole powers. So that's, by the way, I think it's a great portal if you want to teach kids mathematics. The kids say, oh, why should I learn powers? I say, well, but don't you appreciate music? Yes, I do. How can you possibly, how else can you understand the ratio of the frequencies between the notes if you don't understand the power, the 12th root of 2? So this is like a basic ingredient. So this is one solution, and this is called equal temperament. But this is something which has become a standard only recently, as I found out. But actually, there is another one, it's called just temperament. And it goes back to Pythagoras, who was a very interesting man. And one of his quirks was, well, from our perspective, was that he did not believe in irrational numbers. A number had to be rational. Square root of 2 even would not exist in his world. But he observed that actually, if you take the 7th tone, okay, so you have the 7th tone, which is like, it's usually called perfect fifth, because it is the 5th white key. If you don't, there are two black keys in the middle, but you don't count them. So it's a 5th white key. It's perfect fifth. So you have to then take 2 to the power 7 over 12. And it turns out to be very close to 3/2. A rational number, a fraction, which he liked. So then he suggested you can generate all the tones, all the pitches by using powers of 3 over 2. So how would it work? Well, you would know the 7th tone, then you would know the 14th. The 14th will be 9 over 4. But then you can bring it back. It's like on a clock. 14 is the same as 2 p.m. So you can bring it back by dividing by 2. You will get then the frequency for the 2nd note. And because 7 is relatively prime to 12, a mathematician would say it's a generator of the finite group Z modulo 12Z. So a very nice mathematical result is contained in here, okay? But the problem is, if you do it 11 times, then the gap between 11 and 12, the gap will accumulate. And that's how you get what sometimes people call the wolf sounds. So it's beautiful because you can do only use fractions. But it doesn't quite close. It doesn't quite work. And it's a great metaphor about the difference between mathematics and music. And maybe, but I want to take it in a positive sense, not in a negative sense. That I don't want to say, oh, I'm a mathematician, so in my world everything's precise and rigorous and clear, and in the world of a musician it's all kind of blurry and vague. On the contrary, in mathematics, it can also be blurry and vague, but also in music, it can be very precise and rigorous, as Marc just showed us. So I think rather we should try to find these areas where we can help each other and we can find something to learn from each other. And so that brings me to this beautiful quote from Hermann von Helm, who was a great physician and physicist, and many concepts in physics and psychologist named after him. And so I think it's actually, it summarizes very well, that mathematics and music, the most sharply contrasted fields, and yet there's a close connection between them, because manifestations of artist genius are but the unconscious expressions of mysteriously acting rationality. So let's find more connections between math and music. Thank you very much.
So this is, the first part was great. I love listening to these guys talk. And I suppose because we're recording, I should say Ed Frenkel, Marc Weidenbaum, I'm Charles Lindsay. And so this is the part I've really been looking forward to, and something that I hope you feel you're sharing in something kind of special, because this is a little bit of, you know, a conversation that we've started with drinks and stuff, and now we're sharing that, and sharing it literally, because you all are going to come in on the conversation as you care to. So what we're going to do now is, I think Marc's going to ask Ed a question, and we're just going to see where that goes. And I'm the axeman. If it starts running on too long, we'll move to the next question. So, Marc, please ask Ed some interesting questions. See what we can provoke here.
Sure. Well, I had a bunch as I read the book, and I think that one of the many parallels between the things we're exploring is this idea of, for those of you who have not read the book, the early part in particular focuses on the education that Ed experienced and the challenges he had, which are unique to say the least, but also the culture that allowed for ideas to take place. And one thing that really intrigued me was you said that, how do you put it? You said that the particular type of seminar, for example, could only exist in a totalitarian regime. Could you talk a bit about the culture that allowed math to occur?
Very good question. Yeah. So I grew up in the Soviet Union and Russia, and in the 80s, I sort of come of age in the 80s, and so I experienced some of the sort of Soviet Union and sort of the era of communism, socialism, whatever you call it. By the way, today is the birthday of Lenin, also. It's just kind of a random thought. And because see, this is one of those things which kind of stays with you. If you had grown up in the Soviet Union, a certain era, it's something you'll never forget. But one of the positive aspects of that was the sort of level of intensity of intellectual pursuit in certain areas. And in my book, I talk about the fact that actually it was very difficult to do work in the arts or in the humanities because it was so tightly controlled by the government. But mathematics was one of those oases of intellectual pursuit, of creativity, where a lot of talented people went to be free from dogmas of an ideology. And so sometimes people ask me about this and say, well, so that was a good thing. Well, it's like, well, don't try it at home. You know, so it's not a good recipe for creating a good atmosphere for educating mathematicians and so on, and having a good community of mathematicians. But at the same time, it's something to be said about that it's human nature to find this sort of outlet for creativity and intellectual pursuit. And so where did people find it? They found it in math. They found it in music as well. But if you look at someone like Shostakovich, who was severely persecuted by the government, who was constantly sort of had this Damocles sword above him, and it was decided sort of by the whim of Stalin as to whether he liked his opera or his concerto, or he didn't like, and depending on that, he could be ostracized and basically become persona non grata in symphony halls and theaters, or suddenly he would be declared the most amazing musician and composer. So in mathematics, we didn't have that because Stalin, for one, didn't understand mathematics. He understood that mathematics was important because he needed mathematicians for the bomb, and so he knew that those people are necessary somehow, and they're not really political, so okay, so let them be, and so on. So there are all these interesting aspects, and I think that I try to touch upon that in my book. And I think that we're still waiting to sort of get the full history of the full story of what happened. But I think an interesting question here is, how do we foster that in a sort of, let's say, free society or democratic society where there are no, of course we also have some pressures and so on of kind of maybe of slightly different nature, of maybe pressures of uniformity in a sense, and more so now that we live in this sort of almost a computer simulation where every time you want to buy a book, you just kind of, it's much easier to buy what Amazon suggests you buy, you know. And sometimes they do a good job, you know, like many of my friends got emails saying that they should buy my book, so sometimes it works, but but you know what I'm saying. So there are some pressures, but how do you find, so, and I'm actually curious, as you're as a musician, so do you feel that pressure, that pressure of sort of not being, of being more kind of a conformist? And I think it's always maybe in the world of an artist that you feel that. How do you deal with that? In other words, how do you deal with this sort of comfortable life? What drives an artist in the United States, you know, in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 21st century?
That's very interesting. Well, I have a very specific answer from my own personal experience. And I should always clarify that the extent to which I make music is one step removed, and the extent to which I do art is still a work in progress. But the idea of doing projects that are artistic and that are exploring ideas in an artistic way, I think that for me, it was a very conscious decision to start taking many more risks. And this happened around 5 or 6 years ago. I'd always worked for corporations and always enjoyed a certain amount of seniority, and I'd really come to enjoy bureaucracy. And so I worked pretty much straight from college through around 2008, 2009 for pretty large companies or small companies that became large. And I enjoyed the comfort, though I questioned it a little bit. And I enjoyed the opportunity because the ability for a lot of people to have a goal like make a magazine or publish tons of comics or to help a client come to a conclusion was something you could only do with groups of people. But about 5 or 6 years ago, I started to really think about why I was fearful. Like, was I really excited to be in these places, or was I doing it out of security? So I started to really question that and do things which ironically, my risks were other people's security. Like, I got married, I bought a house, we had a kid. But I also started to do projects that had been deep in my mind, but I had been resisting. And I've been so much happier since I started doing that. So someone asked me a similar question recently, which is like, do you worry when you do some of these projects that no one's going to show up, or that no one's going to respond, or no one's going to enjoy it? And I was like, well, I don't worry per se, but I'll say that if I'm not worried, then I start getting worried, because I'm doing all of this to experience a sense of risk. Not like bungee jumping, not stupid foolhardy risk, but if I feel like if I'm not doing something that could fail, then I'm not going far enough.
Charles, what drives an artist in the 21st century?
Well, I can barely even speak for myself, but I wonder if what you're describing as risk is more a sense of invention. I mean, what's the risk, really? I mean, that's one of the things I always thought, like I'm not a sort of an online gamer. I mean, I don't do that, but I always thought, you know, people get really into these things, but what's the risk? I always thought, like there's no electric shock if you screw up, let alone a limb gets knocked off. I'm like, really? That's, you know, so where's the buzz? Where's the endorphin kick? I mean, I think of what I do personally. I think one of the reasons that I'm at the SETI Institute is this sense of searching and questioning. And in my case, I mean, I'm also an inventor. So, but I can only speak for myself. I mean, I would like to think that's central to a lot of contemporary art, but art is this giant umbrella. There's so much stuff resting under art. So,
but why take risks? So the question is, so for example, as a mathematician, I can tell you that what motivates me and what motivates, I think, most mathematicians is really, and that might sound counterintuitive to people who are not mathematicians, because most of us get exposed to this most boring and lifeless and sort of irrelevant part of math, or the way it's taught is boring and irrelevant. But for us, it's really about pursuit of truth and beauty, and really about a hunger to understand how the world works. And I imagine that for an artist or a musician, it's the same drive that causes. Is that
You would hope so. You would hope so, but there's also a lot of rote creativity. So I think that the risk I'm referring to is the risk of doing things that you might not get the immediate response to. It's easy to create work that you're likely to get a positive response to, but it's harder, but more
But that's because
satisfying.
in part, so in my talk I mentioned this difference which is between math and music, say, in that mathematics is objective. It presents sort of this objective reality that means the same thing to everyone. It doesn't depend on our perception. And music certainly depends on our perception. We may like or not like the same composer and so on, right? But I think and this is the core of that issue, because you know, obviously it has happened so many artists and musicians that their work was not appreciated by their contemporaries, and maybe they died, you know, poor and unappreciated, and then suddenly years later they became appreciated. In math, it's less likely, because a mathematical work, you may say it's not interesting, but you cannot say that if it's right or wrong is not a matter of perception. And so in some sense, we are more insulated from that, from this sort of negative reaction of the audience. The negative reaction is still there. They will say, okay, well, he did that, or she did that, but it wasn't so interesting, or it was derivative. It was too close to what someone else used, exploited ideas of someone else. But they will never say it would be better if that person did not even do that. So in somehow that they contributed in a negative way. So because any theorem that is proved and is correct contributes in a positive way.
And I'm trying to think, like, what other word references math in arts besides derivative? I mean, it's a word from mathematics, isn't it interesting? And everything grows incrementally. I mean, it's very much like evolution. Well, let's say
we integrate things into our lives.
Sure. So then, how big are the steps? But it's an interesting question. I mean, I think as an artist, one of the things that, as an artist, as a human, you know, I think I'm very interested in pattern recognition and how we sense kind of everything. I'm like a glutton for senses. But I do think in the arts that we can, in other artists, whether you're an artist or not, sense a sort of an integrity and honesty, a pushing a frontier, a taking risks. And I think even if the art doesn't appeal in terms of subject or whatever it might be, I think that sense, our sense of that can cut through. I mean, I know that in one of the examples for me was Maria Abramovich, who's huge now, and people have lots of opinions, very polarized. But, you know, I don't have a real interest in feminism per se. It's just not my theme of interest. And her work made me really interested. And that, I think, is an incredible, and that can happen in a book. You read a topic about something, you think, well, I'm not really that interested. You read the book and you go, oh my God, you know, there you are. You just went through 400 pages.
She did stuff against the grain, you know, like she went against.
Totally.
It was not that she was appreciated. She did stuff, and the kind of work that she did in the early years. You know, quite amazing. I've seen some videos of some of the work that she had done.
It's really
absolutely
self-sacrifice.
And it was a taking risk. It was a taking risk, sort of in the best sense of the word.
Have you read this Kim Stanley Robinson novel, the science fiction novel 2312? It takes place 300 years from 2 years ago, and in the book, certain artists from right now, notably Maria Abramovic, Philip Glass, and Andy Goldsworthy, are 300 years from now utter pop culture. That you go to see a Philip Glass work, and the entire audience sings along like it's the Messiah, like the Messiah sing-along, that is.
So there is a danger of that too.
Well, right? He didn't see it as a danger in the book. He sees it as like Goldsworthy, he sees it as a model for terraforming. So as we expand into the universe, Goldsworthy's idea of putting your imprint on the land and land work becomes a model for how you terraform.
But so 300 years from now. So the people at the aliens at Kepler,
there's no aliens.
They would still be 200 years more.
You still have 200 years to the 500 mark. But there's no aliens in his work. The galaxy is only filled by humans who have themselves transformed themselves. So human transformation of itself is through Abramovic, and transformation of the land is through Goldsworthy. And the idea that in the future, works that are experimental become popular and their impact becomes felt is, I think, a really interesting thread through this. Like, you talk about how a theorem can take 350 years to be proved. So what remains an esoteric field suddenly has lasting impact or plays a role in day-to-day. But
nowadays, this kind of mathematics, which when you were referring to Fermat's last theorem, one of the most famous results in mathematics, which was actually the interesting story behind this, if in case some of you haven't heard this before, this mathematician Pierre Fermat in the 17th century wrote on the margin of a book that he found this beautiful formula, and then he found a beautiful proof, but the margin is too small to contain it. So it's kind of a Twitter-like proof for the 17th century. But people took it seriously as a challenge, and for 350 years they tried to prove this result to no avail, because they would always find gaps and mistakes and so on, until Andrew Wiles and Richard Taylor proved it in the mid-1990s. But and one could say, well, is this useful in any sense? But, well, this particular result may not be so useful, but in the course of proving this theorem, mathematicians discovered some new areas of mathematics, and some of in number theory in particular, which I talked about earlier, and some of that math is now integral to our lives in a sense through encryption when we connect to our bank accounts, when we send emails and so on, and which is now being used by everyone and also misused, as we recently found out. So that's very interesting. That in a sense, the stuff in math that we are often told that how is what you do useful? And actually, there was this great book by a British mathematician, G.H. Hardy, which is called Mathematician's Apology. So it was kind of beginning of the 20th century. And he said, look, leave us alone. It is useless. We are just driven by truth and beauty. And of course, in a sort of like a nice kind of, especially when you're a young graduate student or whatever, you read this book and you're like, yes, this is our guy. But the funny thing is, it's both. It's both truth and beauty, and then it also becomes useful, right? But with music, I think it's also true that it is how is it useful? So I feel some affinity to musicians, to artists, because you guys also get accused of the same thing. So how do you answer that question? How is music useful?
I have to say it's not a question that's been posed to me very often.
I'm really glad he asked you.
Yeah. I mean, at the most basic level, I'm intrigued by the things that distinguish us as a species. And there's amazing music made by birds, and there's amazing rituals made by various species. But it's pretty clear that society has evolved to the point at which the production of art is something that distinguishes us. And I think that you can observe it as a critic, or you can participate as an artist or as a facilitator. Mm-hmm. But doing that seems to be a great way to figure out what makes you human.
Very good.
That's as close as I can get to an answer.
So guys, we could, this is great.
We can go on like this for hours.
Questions.
Yeah.
If I may, I'm going to just ask, my collaborator Lawrence Doyle is here, and we have this wonderful sort of ritual where we have lunch when I'm out here, which is about quarterly, and the lunches sometimes go 4 or 5 hours, and I now record them. Anyway, it's good stuff very much in this area. So I just wanted to, Lawrence, do you have a question? There was one of, we were saying things like, the math is not in the chalk. I don't know if we would say the music's not in the violin, but any question that you would like to ask either or both of these gentlemen?
Yeah, well, like Charlie said, we've worked with humpback whales and bottlenose dolphins and so on, and they play. That's one of the definitions of intelligence, and they make music, and it's inexplicable exactly why they make the music. There's a lot of speculation. For example, humpback whales from Alaska go to Hawaii and they make these vocalizations, but it's the males that are attracted and get all together and sing. They come as close as possible to singing the same song. But if I had to, just from the phonemes, specify the most complex communicators on the planet, I'd give it to humpback whales. We cannot make the frequencies and the modulations that they do. So just from a consideration of what makes us human, maybe we should say what makes us earthlings.
Yeah. May I?
Yes.
I really appreciate you bringing that up. That social role is such an important thing, and that's a really nice distinction. I like having my humanity thrown back at me. Thank you. Where else than SETI to be told not to focus on the Earth?
What do they think? What do dolphins think about our music?
Yeah, they're definitely. Yeah, it's too loud.
It's too loud. It's like disco, kind of like disco. Or?
But the interesting thing about that is that.
Are you allowed to say that's bad?
The idea that inherently music serves this social purpose is fascinating. I teach a class about sound, and I had an app developer speak 2 weeks ago to my class, and he brought up this great example that I'd forgotten about, which is about that the Sioux Indians had a tribal chants, and it has come to be understood that part of the reason they did that was to flatten the land when they got to a new place. So it had a social purpose, it was collective, but it also had a functional purpose. And so what I've been trying to explore, and it was a beautiful example that clarified much of what I tried to get to my students, and he did it with one slide. But I found that with a junto, what's been really exciting is to recognize that same social purpose, but to look specifically at the social union of musicians as themselves a kind of, not like a subspecies. Like in Ed's talk, he talked about math being a universal language, and my understanding about music, it's frequently said music's a universal language, but I think it's one that musicians speak to each other more than they speak to other people.
Yeah, of course.
Hi. I have a couple of 2-year-olds at home, and so I'm watching them bootstrap their brains over time. And what strikes me over and over, compared to, say, cats and dogs that I've lived with, for instance, is how amazingly good they are at symbol recognition, of symbol to an actual object recognition. And this extends to like a rhythmic sense and musical sense, as well as a mathematical sense. Like they, see a picture of something which is really a 2-dimensional transform of a 3-dimensional object. It's a mapping, right? And so I think there's absolutely something that our species has specialized in. So I'm going to maybe challenge Ed's idea of the universal mathematics a little bit and say, like, well, how human is this whole, like, music, math, art, science thing, as opposed to, some other critter out there, either in the ocean or on an exoplanet somewhere? How different and specific to, hominids, especially our hominid species, is this kind of sense of ease with these kind of mappings, a mapping of time into musical segments and a mapping of space into these 2-dimensional images.
Very good question. So, yes, it makes sense. I mean, of course, and I don't know the answer. I have a conjecture. There are different answers, but I find that, first of all, I already mentioned that in my talk, that mathematics has a special quality. And I'm not saying that because I don't say, I'm a mathematician, so I am doing sort of this advertisement for mathematics, that we are better in some sense. No, it's not that we are better, but it's something very special. For example, other animals, as far as we know, they don't do math. Unlike, say, birds can chirp, but they can't really count as well, as far as we know. They might be hiding it from us, I don't know. But actually, although today there was an article that monkeys can do some math. But usually animals can do some small numbers, additional small numbers. At least that's what experiments show. And actually, human brain is structured in a very interesting way, that when you add small numbers, one area of the brain lights up, but when numbers become larger, another area lights up. So then once it becomes more abstract. So the way I think about mathematics is that it's kind of a language of abstraction, and so that's what sort of abstraction is really built on. And that's where I think it connects to music and to art, through that side of it. So even if art and music is not as is much more subjective and so on, but it is also, art is also language of abstraction. So is music, right? So obviously there's something about human brain which distinguishes us from other species. And again, I'm not saying that we're necessarily better, but maybe different, And so there is something very special, and you're right, because you talk about patterns, and that's what I mean by abstraction. So the same mathematician G.H. Hardy, whom I mentioned earlier, he actually said, mathematician is a maker of patterns, just the way an artist or a musician are. And so and that's what you were referring to, that we absorb information and we use with our brain, we're capable of seeing similarities and seeing patterns and discerning them. And we seem to be, as a species, very good at it, right? So the question is, how does this all come about? But I also think another question that I'm really interested in is what is sort of beneath the surface. In other words, that certain things that we find, I mean, we kind of tend to think, or at least I used to think, that we kind of understand the world. We kind of understand 90% of the world. And then we're kind of trying to fill in the remaining 10%. But now I think the opposite. I think we only understand 10%. And we have to, and for me, it's a great metaphor, what I talked about earlier about the music tones. I always thought that this was totally understood and everybody, so at least such a basic thing as to what are the frequencies of notes. Of course, everybody, and then it was discovered, it was shocked to discover that that's not the case. And how many other things are in the world which I think are understood, but actually are not. And so that's the first question. And the second question is, what are the things that we can really rely on? What can we hold on to in order to navigate our way in the world and try to understand what's really going on. And I think math and art and music are the three.
I mean, wouldn't you rather live in a world where most of it is not understood? 90% of it is frontier.
Well, I
rather than the
am
other way
living
around?
in that world now. You know?
I would. I mean,
Yes,
I
and
like
I-
the idea of the frontier.
That's
So,
right.
we have a question
Okay.
from Jill Tartar.
So in the SETI world, historically, we've been prone to say mathematics is a universal language, and therefore mathematics will be the basis with which we can communicate ideas to an alien species. But we've had a couple of mathematicians come and talk to us over the past year, Keith Devlin from Stanford in particular, who agrees that mathematics are universal, but the representation of the mathematics, the abstraction, is so much a function of the human brain that we might well be talking about exactly the same thing, but it's represented so differently that we never get to the understanding that it's in fact the same thing. What do you think about that?
No, that's a good point. And in other words, there is a human element in there. And I talked about Pythagoras. I mean, Pythagoras was great, and he actually believed that everything is based on numbers. He said, all is number, right? It's a famous saying which is attributed to Pythagoras. But Pythagoras, for example, but ironically, he missed the most interesting numbers. He did not believe in irrational numbers. And I would say irrational numbers are more interesting than rational numbers, not because of rational, irrational. You know, they're called rational not because they do things in the right way, but because they are fractions, ratios. So ratio gives rise to rational. And the ones which are not ratios of whole numbers, they're called irrational. So he missed those. And what about complex numbers? Does the square root of -1 exist? For many years, for centuries, humans thought, no, because the square of any number is positive. So how can you have a square root of -1, say? But it turns out that there is this whole area of mathematics which is very interesting and fruitful and useful that you discover when you introduce those numbers, right? So that it's a struggle of ideas, and at different times, humans have wrong ideas, so to speak, or the ideas which are not fruitful, so that the other idea turns out to be more fruitful or more useful and leads to a much more interesting context, you see. So in that sense, it's possible that we may be even experiencing the same math, or discovering the same math as say, another civilization. But maybe we have different standards of rigor and proof, and also we just don't believe certain things could possibly be true. But at the end of the day, I think, we all converge to the same thing. So that's my answer. In other words, at any given moment, there could be this kind of disagreements and disparities between different civilizations, say, discovering mathematics. But at the end of the day, we all converge because mathematics forces us to do, there is a right way, in some sense, I think. And there was this great quote from mathematician Georg Cantor, the German mathematician who came up with the theory of infinity. And he was criticized by people at the time, by most mathematicians, who said that this is nonsense and this is a disease on the body sort of mathematics, which has to be removed. And they said, you can't do that. So he did something about infinity, and they said, no, you can't do that. And then he wrote, he said, yes, I can, because the essence of mathematics lies in its freedom. There are some axioms, there are some rules. There are some rules of logical inference, for example. But beyond that, you are free to go as far as you can. And so we may be confused, and we may be lost, we as individuals, we as species, you know, but eventually we will find our way. That's what I think.
It's a long cosmic day, though.
The question?
I think the talk tonight, both speaker on music and math, is wonderful. So I want to encourage both speakers to do more collaboration in the future. Just like Carl Sagan was an evangelist of astronomy, I think both of you can be evangelists for both mathematics and music. I would like to call both of you the M and M team, right? Both music and math begin with M.
And he's also Mark, so.
I'm sure. A few years ago, you know, I was speaking to a very accomplished pianist, and he played at different churches, and I said there's a strong relationship between music and math. And he answered to me in a very confident manner, no. Since I'm a math teacher, I knew that's not true, And I think both of you tonight, brought the point home. I think it's really nice that in the future, you either do a book together or maybe a video together. As you know, when you publish a book, the publisher always just smell the profit, right? But I think with the topic together, music and math, I think you will sell, You can sell to them, Especially, I think, to the school level, high school or junior high level, elementary school, But I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, this Thursday, the Junto project will, in one way or another, draw from your work. So I'd love to talk with you about what that project will be.
A question?
Hi. So, are you the gentleman from the Colbert Report who drew equations on a naked lady?
Well, my character did that in the movie.
Oh, okay. So it was one of the equations, the Drake equation.
Was one of the equations?
The Drake equation.
Drake equation.
The Drake equation is from Frank Drake here and predicts the likeliness of other life in the universe, among other things. But it was not that equation that you were tattooing on her.
Or was it? I don't know. Well, not knowingly. It may have been one. But actually, so for those who haven't seen the episode, what are you waiting for? By the way, no, it's joking. But there is a film which is referenced, which is called Rights of Love and Math. And in that film, the premise is that a mathematician finds a formula of love, and then he is distraught by the fact that it's so powerful it could be misused by the powers that be. He decides to hide it and to tattoo it on the body of his lover, who represents mathematics. It's a kind of allegorical thing. Anyway, but the question is, what is the formula, right? And the formula, it's a formula of love, but, well, it's a formula playing the role of formula of love in the movie. And it was one of my formulas. I kind of felt that I wanted to cast, as a formula of love, to cast one of my own formulas, which actually I co-wrote from a paper I co-wrote with my two colleagues. Something that has to do with models of quantum field theory. But I would, maybe for the next movie, I should use that formula, the Drake formula.
Drake equation would be
Drake
great.
equation, yes.
Yeah, it'd be excellent. Yeah.
Great
How are we
question.
doing here? Mugs? Okay. Thanks, Adrian. Okay. You guys have been great. We could go all night, but apparently we're not going to go all night tonight. So, I'd like to present you, Marc Weidenbaum, and Ed Frenkel with the SETI cups.
Thank you.
And thank you for your pledge to use the Drake equation in your next work. That's great.
Apparently that's what's being whispered right here. It was explained to me.
Yes. Thank you all for coming out, the audience that will see it in the future at some point. But thank you, all of you, for coming tonight. Super appreciated. There may be a few questions available for these guys, then they're off to San Francisco. But it's great to be here, and excellent audience. Thank you.